here. For those of you at home, you can follow along with your own copies. This is a kind of follow the bouncing ball sort of flow that we're going for here.
Right here, this is pretty much like where Lacan is introducing, all right, you got, East Coast, West Coast, you got Biggie on one end, and then you got Tupac on the other, death row, with the Freud and Jung camp.
Right. So I guess Jung is Tupac.
Maybe.
I would think so, because both popular, but Tupac is, I would say, more than marginally, at least worldwide, above Biggie in terms of just hero worship.
Yeah, definitely more poetic.
I would say so, but it doesn't necessarily deserve that spot, much like Jung, who appeals to our own narcissisms.
Yeah, I would say that, in the crudest sense, there's a Freudian aspect to the narcissism of Biggie, and trying to maintain the ego ideal and his ideal ego. Loves it when he gets called Big Papa. There's the Oedipalization right there. But then something like with Tupac, he's always talking about his mother, not like in the Oedipalized sense, but you can say the anima image, especially Hail Mary. What is it? Gangster's Paradise, Pimp's Paradise. What?
Gangster's Paradise.
Gangster's Paradise. Yeah.
I would say that
all these archetypal things.
Biggie may have been more successfully Oedipalized, because if you look at Tupac and his various personae and the way they vied for supremacy in his life, you see an example of what Lacan and Leclerc are going to discuss later on in the seminar. We'll hopefully touch on it today, which is the ego ideal and the ideal ego ending up on the same plane and becoming, in some sense, overlapped and vying for influence, or just being confused in a potentially dangerous way.
Yeah.
That's sort of what happened with Tupac. If what people say is to be believed, he over-identified with the character that he played in Juice, and it sort of warped his sense of self. And I think we've got an example of maybe narcissism and idealization going on there in a very interesting way. So maybe this will come back up as we explore these two chapters.
Exactly.
But Andrew, you're the Jung expert, the resident Jungian. No, I'm sorry, I should say you're not a Jungian, but you are undergoing Jungian analysis.
Yeah.
And despite yourself, you have a certain attraction to
some extent to the Jungian theory, and a little basic understanding, at least in the not only just knowing about what archetypes are, which every freaking young bro content creator is always trying to talk about, the collective unconscious, about the shadow or the self, but also the clinical aspect, which surprisingly, he gives lectures on clinical technique. And then if you look on his essays, which is being talked about right here, the Metamorphoses et Symbols de la Libido, which is actually translated into what is it, the psychology of the unconscious, or the unconscious and psychology. Yeah, psychology of the unconscious is what it's called. So there's a bunch of essays, and also symbols of transformation, which tie into what will be talked about in the difference of libido from Jung and Freud, which was talked about in last seminar, or last lecture in the seminar. There's this, rather than just a purely sexual nature to libido and satisfaction of the love object. There's rather, from the looks of psychotic schizophrenic patients, an inverted metamorphosis, meaning that really what they show is the fact that there is this metamorphosis in libido, which again, meaning transformation via certain symbols that manifest as complexes in the unconscious through the projection of them onto reality, onto people, onto the analyst, kind of like a transference. And then even the way they play out in dreams and reoccurring themes, and they manifest as things that would seem like archetypes. And that's pretty much like what he wants to get at, that there's things in the transference that happen, or what you would call a projection in the transference, where it's not merely just like neurotic transference of like, you know, something of the past being in the father, but just something in general that could be fixated or deadlocked into the unconscious, something that's unconscious, not because it's repressed, just because that just don't know about it.
Can you come closer to the camera?
Yes.
I mean, we can hear you fine, but
It's
just a little bit
but
better.
you were able to hear everything, right? At least general background of what Jung is working with.
Right. And
we'll see the criticisms of Freud or of Jung by Freud and even Lacan.
Right. As usual, Lacan is attempting to rescue Freud's technique from the grips of this larger, more popular, I would say, sort of psyche-based sort of, like mythopoesis, I think it's called, like poetic, if I'm saying that correctly, context in which he feels it may be bogged down. And the concept of libido specifically, he feels needs to be very carefully and like almost surgically removed from this misinterpreted state.
And I would say Jung is the same way of like of Freud, in the sense that they neither really had a articulated theory of desire in the same way that Lacan will develop, or even talk about it like in the same way of desire the other, or bringing any sense of intersubjectivity. Although you could see him being a culprit of a two-body psychology in which it's ego psychology, because with this whole thing of a transformation of through symbols, transformation of the libido, it's something that brings integration, and the unconscious synthesizes itself. Any fragments of the of what he would call the self, which is like the archetype of like maybe a healthy ego, something that could have some like existential kind of layout of like finding your personal fulfillment, your psychic fulfillment. They're all fragmented, or he would say the psychology is the science of the soul, as he gets more into his religious sentiments later on in his life. Fragments of the soul, fragments of the self that become integrated into the ego via the unconscious, and in his process of like dreams, how dreams show, in a sense, libidinal investment, not in a sexual sense, but in a psychic sense. That's why he believes that libido is overall psychic rather than sexual. It has this inversion or introversion to develop itself and develop the healthy ego for that particular individual. But at the same time, it's not like for him the ego is this like displacement, this misrecognition. The ego is a fact. It is empirical fact to him, and it is given, but yet the ego is also not something to be taken seriously, because it's weird. He's like, it's like a persona or a mask that we wear because, we got to act like a certain way with society, and some aspects of the ego become repressed, and that aspect of that mask that is hidden or of the ego is the shadow.
Which needs to be,
Yeah.
from your point of view, reincorporated into the persona of the patient in some sense.
Yes.
Or maybe persona is not the right word, but the larger psychical profile of the patient.
Yeah. And again, though, it's like with all these things, it's like you could see being for Freudo-Lacanian and Zizek'ian, like there's like this way in which like it kind of like this could act as fantasy, which creates a coherent structure for the ego function to pretty much enjoy its symptom, its xanthome, and make it again like more coherent to where it's still in this sense of false mastery, you know, this misrecognition, méconnaissance, as Lacan will say.
And the pervasive misrecognition surrounding libido, as we discussed it in the previous chapter, I remember Lacan wants to clarify that the libido is not necessarily about the propagation of the species, and its aim is not purely utilitarian in that sense.
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he believes that to a certain degree in Jung, that sort of like telos of the ego is assumed, or
Yes,
of the libido, that is.
There is some teleology to his theory of libido, whereas there is no teleology in Freud, but rather this investment in an economy, a libido economy, a circulation.
Economy.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting word, and it's going to be used to even better effect, I think, in later chapters, maybe later seminars, but it really is a very apt metaphor for how he conceives of the libido, and it leaves more room for the notion of the drive, I would say.
Which Jung does not have a theory of drives. He's got a theory of complexes, but it's like I feel like these affect complexes are, in a sense, the more they repeat, it's like they seem to have some type of death drive, not a sort of teleological goal of integration in the long run.
So what's so interesting to me about these early chapters, something that I didn't expect, was this focus on, as he says here, the psychosis, because I would have thought that he would go right for neurosis, which we consider generally to be the more common psychic structure among patients. There are many more neurotics than there are psychotics out there, but he is really making an effort to define what the psychoses are and the relationship between the libido and the psychoses. I would think, one, because it, as you often mention, Freud did not directly deal with psychotics. Two, because he feels Jung is completely off the mark with his understanding of the relationship between libido and the psychoses, but also because understanding the psychoses as a sort of background context for the exploration of other psychic structures is very useful.
Yeah.
Maybe more so than even beginning with just like regular neurosis.
And Freud's main thing of not acknowledging the clinical structure of psychoses in the analytic sense was the fact that he couldn't get them to transfer or associate, that they couldn't hold a discourse. And so he thought that they couldn't get under analysis. And I think whether or not like there's could be some reconciliation between analytical psychology and psychoanalysis, Jung was a psychiatrist, whereas Freud was a physician and neurologist. So Jung had more experience with, the psychotic schizophrenics, the overall mad in the like the psych ward, the psychiatry, like the hospitals, that Freud didn't.
And right, so this analytic theory and its predication on this idea of psychosis easily lends itself to this vast psychic pantheism. And I just think it's interesting that he has this emphasis on psychosis and the libido here, because it's almost as if he's saying, like, if these structures aren't applicable to the libido in psychosis, then we can't understand what the libido is doing for the neurotic. It needs to be comprehensible across the board.
Mm-hmm.
But he mentions the archetypes here, and we have this very challenging distinction between ego drives and libidinal drives. And Andrew, maybe you can touch on that a little bit.
I think what he sees is there's this, and for Freud, he will have these two drives, which I think this is like obviously before his essay on death drive, or beyond the pleasure principle. But in this aspect where this is on narcissism essay, which was 1925, if I'm not mistaken. He's working on this distinction between libido and ego. And libido drive, the trieb, the instinct, is something that just aims at its satisfaction. But then why does it not just stay there? Or why does it formulate into the ego, and then the ego continue that? So obviously the ego is formed by libido, but why must the libido stay in this economy of a narcissism, of an ego, in which this narcissism is an idealization of satisfaction of its own body to an extent, and minimal narcissism, not like extreme narcissism in the clinical sense, in which they cannot really make a distinction between their inwelt and then the umwelt, that they really see themselves in everything and everybody. They have no empathy or affects towards anybody. It's this, again, what he talks about in the actual his definition of narcissism. It's like this like thaumaturgy of these grandiose self, in which they could speak their creation into existence. They literally believe that they could change reality just like that they can make everything happen, that everything is just centered around them, almost like, and it's like pretty much psychoanalytic way of describing solipsism. But there is like this minimal form that we at least have. We're always reflecting back to ourselves. We're wondering about our own safety, our own well-being, our satisfaction, our pleasure, avoiding pain, all these basic things. But if libido is aimed at its own immediate satisfaction and hunger, warmth from the mother, security and all that, then why invest in the ego? And that's where he was trying to get at. And ultimately he'll say there will still be two drives, the ego and the libidinal drives.
Right. And it's, as you say, the central question here is not why is there narcissism, but why are there two narcissisms? And unlike Jung, as you mentioned, he doesn't just assume the ego as a given fact. The ego is something of a riddle here in that why does it need to form at all? Why can't primary narcissism with its satisfaction just be the end point of narcissism?
And this is where I think where at least Lacan's reading is that he sees Freud being more dialectical than he would like to assume. And I don't really see any dialectical thinking in the works of Jung at all, that everything is just like a positive transformation, just like this harmonious synthesis in some instances. Yeah, there are still conflicts and problems within the psyche. He will say like religious motifs, like man is capable of both good and evil. In a sense, there is an evil with man, and man must learn how to integrate his evil so that it doesn't take over him. That's kind of a paraphrase, but most people will get the idea if they've heard any kind of commentary on Jung or Jung himself using like these religious, what's the term, iconography, or just like religious terminology to describe the state of man, but doesn't really see it as a dialectical split or the consciousness ego as a split. It's more of like this, what do we say? Telos, this positive telos.
Right. And that's the word that comes to mind once again, because I see he's talking about mythology, the theory of the drives, instincts, and of course, what he says here, the final ends of the preservation of the individual, and those of the continuity of the species. And what this makes me think of, and we're not there yet, we might not be there for years hence, but here we have in the embryonic form, in some sense, a lack of the sexual relation. There is no sexual relation, in the sense that what he seems to be saying is that there is this complementarity in Jung between the sexes.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be the explicit yin yang sort of Manichaean division necessarily, but when you posit the libido as only serving the aim of propagating the species, that in itself assumes a sort of complementarity between man and woman, between two polarities, a kind of bipolarity of the universe, and that easily lends itself to a larger kind of cosmology.
Yes.
If it isn't limited. And that, I feel, correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't know if this is a very difficult chapter, but I think it's interesting that he is using a certain vocabulary when Lacan, who seems like someone who is very much fascinated by the symbologies of different cultures,
yes,
is very careful also to stick with a much more anatomical, scientific, similar to what Freud usually resorts to when he's describing different psychic phenomena, but he finds these, like the germplasm here, to be a more appropriate metaphor in contradistinction with the whole like Jungian archetypal cosmology.
Yeah,
I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, because even him also being acquainted with religious studies, going through like a Catholic university, also talking about like certain religious figures like Augustine, but you don't see any of this I wouldn't say appeal to religion, but like this trying to think everything in terms of this like psychic pantheism, or the way you worded it, trying to aim ego to the unconscious to integrate with the ego into this higher transcendental self that aligns with a bigger grand scheme or grand narrative that's cosmological.
Because I think we tend to believe that we are being very commonsensical and rational when we interpret sex as ultimately aiming towards just the preservation of this species, the reproduction, replication of the individual. But that in itself is a form of symbolic logic,
Yeah.
which underlying it is, as you just mentioned, this sort of psychic cosmology. So it's interesting, that kind of inversion that he's introducing here, to show you that there's already if an underlying kind of, like religious, teleological worldview to our understanding, our common understandings of sex. And he's saying the libido is something of a different genre entirely.
I think one thing that to point out too is like, yeah, like he's not even sticking towards this, like what you were saying about this biological cosmology, this Darwinian narrative of just like sexuality is to help propagate the species, and there's not for some like instinct because of survival, or because of some type of like Richard Dawkins like selfish gene or some shit like that. And this is why like Freud was careful to distinguish instinct from drive, that in drive there is this compulsive repetition of satisfaction, but satisfaction has nothing to do with instincts, because instincts are there for survival, they're autonomous. But there's something that's not just autonomous about the drive, in which we get more detail in seminar 11. There's like this by chance, this aleatory type thing, but the words compulsive repetition to kind of seem towards it gets not only satisfaction but this mastery of satisfaction. We see this with, again, like if you look at the ego and the libidinal investment of it, it's like there is a sexuality to it in which there's a lure, which we'll talk about in here, the lure, but it's not anything to do with to mate, or sexuality for humans has nothing to do about mating or propagating the species, but there's just this overall constant economy of trying to find that primal satisfaction within the gaze of our own image.
Now, what's interesting, though, is he does postulate the existence of something which does wish to reproduce itself, but he calls it here like germ plasm, which isn't exactly, that's not exactly sexy, I would say.
Yeah.
That's not something that most people would want to imagine is occurring when sex is going on, when libido is expressing itself. It's a germ plasm, but I think it's very telling that he decides on that as the operative metaphor here.
This immortal germplasm substance.
Why is it a germplasm, you think?
Well, I think this thing is what he's playing off of is this in a way of cellular production, in the way or not of cellular production, but of the way that germs reproduce themselves within the body. I think in some sense there's this alien thing in the way like germs in the body could be alien and they invade us. It's as if the ego in a sense is not something natural to us, but alien in the way that it kind of cohabitates and aligns itself as a false master of the body. It constantly reproduces itself, this image. Maybe this germplasm is literally like, if not the image itself, but maybe like this drive.
Right. Or maybe later he would liken it to the lamella, but I don't want to get too in over my
Yeah.
skis here. But what's it's fascinating is he calls the individual parasitic.
Yeah.
So the germplasm is really what wants to, in a very drive-like manner,
Hmm.
reproduce itself. And then the individual is parasitic on that. And he says something that's very striking here, which is from the point of view of the species, individuals are already dead.
Mm. Yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting too. Um, it could be the fact that like, or you guys say like the death drive, or as Zizek would say, it's like a zombie like thing. It's neither living nor dead, but undead.
Exactly. That's exactly what it suggests to
Yeah.
me, is this undead thing. And then what's interesting, speaking of Zizek, we get into genus and species, which is something that Zizek often explores, the relationship between the particular and the universal in the context of Hegelian
Yeah.
dynamics, Hegelian philosophy. But here we have this idea that there is a type that the germplasm is aiming at, uh, which I guess would be, well, genus or species. It doesn't really matter, but the individual, the particular, the exemplar as it's
Yes.
embodied in the individual is not what's at um, is not what's important here. What is important is I guess we could read the individual as being the ego, and the fact that it feeds off of this type, and that puts the misrecognition aspect of it for me into perspective, because it's like, oh, this is an image, as he says here, but it's an image that is auxiliary to the process that's unfolding here.
Pretty much. I think like one thing to say of like um with this like it's this again, it's like this reproduction of this immortal substance, almost like with all germs, but even like with cells in general, like they all die off, but like there's some thing from the old cell that still remains in the new. And I would say it's like with this economy of the libido. And here's what I don't want to say this is the case, but it seems like what is this germplasm metaphor aligning to? Is it the ego or the libido? And is the ego trying to, in a sense, it constantly dies, but then is kind of carried on in the libido in different ways, um through this, if we take the mirror stage not to be just one, as you say, one phenomenon, but it's always happening. Like we're always going, for a lack of a better term, we're always going through mirror stage.
Right. And that's an important thing to point out. It's never completed. And maybe, who knows? I don't know what he had in his head when he first outlined the mirror stage, but stage, of course, would give us the impression that it's a finished at a certain point. But what's fascinating here, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but the idea that the ideal ego, as it's imagined from the perspective of the ego ideal,
Mm-hmm.
can be eruptive and also in conflict with the ego ideal in some sense. And I think he's not so eager to mark the ego ideal as the finish line that we're trying to reach, as he is to, I think, bring out the relationship between the two, but also what is potentially a conflict, the potential conflict between those. And what bridges the two, of course, is the libido. And it's like, what's the libido after?
Yeah.
Well, I think I don't know if that's a question he totally answers, but he's more focused right now on this idea of gestalt and image, and the ego as being a kind of image, right? So here we have the gestalt, and he talks about how there are various animals who can only sort of get their sexual function going if they recognize an image similar to theirs, and that's a gestalt. And
Yes.
that's ethology. And ethologically speaking, at the primary narcissism level, we aren't really any different from most animals as he's defined.
Yeah. And it's like what he was saying in the mirror stage essay. It's like the animals and us will all go through this sort of image captivation, but yet it doesn't maintain itself within the animals. It's not of use. It's just like a momentary lure, but that's it. And he'll always like, not only just in this essay or just this seminar, but even in seminar 2, this comparison between the animal and the man. But in one sense, we are just constantly utilizing the mirror stage more than the animal does, or that we're not a fixed machine, but rather this machine that always breaks down and reconstructs itself, which this machine is the symbol. Yeah.
Right. That almost
not fixed. He would call them jammed machines. That's what he would call animals that are like a
right. And is that because they don't reach that next stage of almost the redoubling of the image?
Yeah.
Is how I would describe it. The animal is, and he says later, what fascinates us about animals is the same thing that fascinates us about children, or the same thing that fascinates us about truly narcissistic individuals is their a kind of self-enclosed satisfaction that contents itself purely with imaginary images.
Yes.
That does not need a further, I don't know if it's sublimation or idealization, but sort of being further funneled into the different channels of the symbolic.
It would definitely, I think it would be more of a sublimation, because it's always, but to the extent, it would be like, it wouldn't be sublimation par excellence. I think there, in some sense, would be a failed sublimation. But I don't know if it's to the degree, because sublimation, if I'm not mistaken, is also the effects of repression, or is it the other way around? Could be getting it wrong.
I think we're going to get to that in a little bit, but he uses this idea of the lure, right? And we just sort of discussed this, and he brings it up again. But the lure, this is something that the lure is sexualized. The lure has to do with the image, and I could maybe even in a sense, it's like, would you say that the animal does have something like an ego almost?
It's like almost like they see an image. Yes, there is this, but again, there's instincts rather than like this drive. I think only insofar as the lure takes place, there does become this sort of ego, where there is small sense of, again, because with the ego comes aggressivity. They only have, I would say, just aggression, whereas aggressivity is more of an imaginary relationship of an expressing of mastery and being, again, the slave to mastery. That's what he talks about in what is it, Function and Field, of how aggression is not aggressivity. And he'll say this later, I think, in like I think the seesaw of desire or fluctuation of libido. But that the animals have aggression, but not aggressivity, because that requires ego mirroring, and this idealization or identification within the imaginary plane.
So he's here trying to bring us back to the optical schema.
Yeah.
He's very carefully and like circumspectly building on this metaphor, this visual metaphor. And in addition to just being like a really fucking cool thing to contemplate, he really does think that optics are the best, that yield the most like useful analogies here with understanding the formation of the ego. Because as he says, it's like, what does he say? That something like what's fascinating about optics is it's the only science that tries to explain the
image, and it doesn't really reduce the, you can't really reduce the image more.
Right, it's like ampliative,
yeah,
rather than reductive in a fascinating way, because it has to explain something that is for all intents and purposes almost like a miraculous
yes
process, and it almost like can't get around the miracle of the production of the image without getting too like woo woo about it. But I think that's what's really fascinating. So yeah, whenever we get to the optical schema, we have to.
Well, I think the one thing that like
and
is interesting about that, as you're going through like thinking about it now when he's talking about optics, is that like we would think that there's certain phenomena of the image that is just like subjective, but thanks to like, you know, now that you've captured an image in the camera, the image has some type of objectivity that lives on. You know, same way like a rainbow or even color is sometimes thought of to be as just subjective. You know, abstract color has no basis in reality. There's always a form to it. But even if you look like, what is science when it says like with light, like you know, we couldn't see like light as it is, or that we always kind of like calculate, or not calculate, but like the way we process light, it's always like projection onto different color spectrums, and that the rainbow can be captured objectively through the camera in picture form. And then look at now, even with video, there's so much that we could do and create filters onto it that make it more objective, via like certain shading, certain effects that alter it.
Right. So I think there he's saying, how do we explain a purely subjective phenomenon as accessible to many people and having the guise of something objective? I like how he mentions here the theory of the little man inside the man, and he's at pains to emphasize that this is not what he's trying to unfold here, is another theory of that, which it too easily can be reduced to this notion of that, which is two-body psychology, ego psychology. Also, I wanted to mention here something he says that's really interesting, is that the subject is not an I. And I think this is only going to make why he's saying, because at this point you're like, wait, it is like that's what he's trying to say here. But it makes more sense a little bit later on when we get to the virtual subject.
Yes. Yeah.
Because what he's saying, and this I think it'll make more sense later on, is that, remember we talked about this being the eye of science.
Yeah.
Oh, this sort of like omniscient sort
Mhm.
of all-seeing apparatus. But what is going to be revealed later is this is how we imagine ourselves to be in relation
Yes.
to this image. But for now, this is just for the sake of illustrating the metaphor at work here. We do have to identify with the I, but we are
Yeah.
not just an I.
We're not just that, we're more than that.
But it's hypothetical, as
Yeah.
he says. Now, God, I think I finally kind of get what's going on here. Yesterday, we talked to Brian Becker
Mhm.
about this. We're going to post that interview
Yeah.
tomorrow, but sometimes, yeah, this can be confusing. Before they introduce the plane mirror, I think this makes the optical schema makes very little sense because it's
Yeah.
like,
And I think with the beginning of the optical schema, just like with the one aspect, it's just to see like a play on of like how the introduction of the I, like the imaginary function, and dealing in just this crude version of a sort of primary narcissism. But over here, you're seeing this play of not only the ego or the ideal ego, but how the ego ideal, and then even the development or introduction to the ego ideal, and this sort of seesaw back and forth between the two, how they kind of play upon each other.
right. So just to recapitulate here, what we have is the union of a real object and an image.
Yeah.
Together, they form what Lacan calls the real image.
Yes, which on the other side of the plane mirror is the image.
This
You
is
never
what
know.
Jacques sees.
Yeah, you never know of the actual vase or not. You know, you just see flowers, but you don't know if there was a vase. Right? It's kind of like the Schrodinger's cat. You're like a real vase, but you only think of the vase because of this image of unification between this supposedly real vase that's upside down in the box and the flowers sticking out. But when it aligns at a certain, degree, and you're in that perfect position, you see this unified image.
The image you see at this point, though, is what he calls the virtual image, which is going
Yes.
to be reflected in the plane mirror.
Yeah. It's not like he's seeing the virtual image outside of the mirror. It's like, no, it's only within the mirror.
Because that's what doesn't make sense to me. Is like before the plane mirror is introduced, I have no idea what is being seen. Like if it's not reflected as a unification between these two.
I think what it was in that concave mirror.
But then wouldn't the eye have to be over here to?
I believe it was in the original one. And then this where it's like he's seeing himself seeing the virtual image.
Well, that's in the next one when he introduces the virtual subject. Right now, it's kind of just a hanging thread because we don't really.
Because in the first one, he is seeing the virtual image of a unified vase with the flower sticking out of it in that concave mirror, because he's standing in front of that mirror, where it's like on the other one, the eye is set, the concave mirror is set behind the eye, and then what he's seeing is the plane mirror reflecting that image. But there has to be some, the one thing that's is a little confusing is like the significance. What does the metaphor of the plane mirror signify? Because I'm thinking it's like him seeing his unified image the I is not just an abstract I, it's a subject in a line with that unified image. And we're not talking about, again, the vase is a metaphor. The vase could be this what we could see is the primary narcissism, and the plane mirror in reflection of the I is the introduction of the secondary narcissism.
Right, exactly. So he's talking about the corporeal image is the primary narcissism, the Umwelt.
Yes.
And that is bodily mastery at its most primary.
Yeah.
In as much as he is a man and not a horse. So I guess brought into that is the type also.
Yeah, and there is some sort of correlation with somatic functions as well, psychosomatic functions and motor skills, motricity in like the Merleau-Ponty sense. That allows one, so it's a false mastery. Again, with reconnaissance, he says that this is not ignorance, that there is some knowledge to it, but it's like a dialectical knowledge of it's illusory, but this illusion still allows you to identify with the spectacle of your body, but it allows you to develop with coordination, with being in the world, readiness to hand to deal with objects. Like I'm dealing with the computer right now. I could type, I could talk to you, I could look you in the eye, I could turn around, all these things that deal with the body.
And let's not forget the wolf child. Remember when the wolf child wanted to grasp something, he had to like go for it in one movement, I believe.
Yeah.
And when he didn't get it, it's like he had to reconstitute himself in a way where it's like he doesn't have this motor mastery because he doesn't have a clear image of himself. And that's really fascinating here, because what's at stake is not just like, oh, this is how I feel about myself, this is what I think I look like. What's at stake is also, as you said, like your motor functions at the very basic level.
How I feel like, how I look like, but how I feel and how I move like.
Right. And then I think this is interesting. He says, for the animal, there's a limited number of pre-established correspondences between the imaginary structure and what interests it. And that is why the symbolic doesn't really take hold for them, right?
Yes. They definitely have no symbolic, because they don't really hold on to any imaginary, like at least identification.
There is no other here, as there is for the human individual, and there's no alter ego that's formed for the animal. So here we're witnessing sort of the birth of the other, so to speak. And he's going to explain with the help of Leclerc and Anoni a little bit what it is, what it means to see, for the individual, the human creature, to see in its place and to structure as a function of this place and of his world, his being. And that's what's really fascinating. That's why he keeps taking recourse with this optical schema, because it's all premised on the possibility of seeing yourself in the place where you think you are.
It comes down to is like, it's an alienation. This is what also differentiates us,
right,
from the animals, that there's this, of course we share a similar structuration in the imaginary, with the lure. We go through a primary narcissism because we're caught in the lure, but yet we take hold of this more, and yet in the introduction of the symbolic order, which obviously this doesn't take place in the symbolic order. I think what is trying to be built up is the fact that at some point, if we could use the Borromeo, not these registers aren't separate, but there is something that enhances the imaginary plane via the symbolic, that allows for the introduction of the secondary narcissism, or this alienation that makes us different from the animals, but also will constitute the ego ideal.
Now back to libido. Now I've kind of lost the thread here, though. Why does libido need to sort of redouble the image in this way for the human being?
And I think one is the fact that, well, with this, there, especially if we're talking about ego ideal now, there is this necessitation for sublimation, because then mechanisms of repression take hold. There is no immediate satisfaction in, let's say, the secondary narcissism as there would be in the primary narcissism, or even like in just libido drives. And it's the same way if like you look at like the whole like traditional Freudian model of like, id, ego, super ego, right? The id is just always aiming towards like these like animalistic things or whatever, just like satisfaction. The ego is like a mediator, and then the super ego is like the imperative, et cetera, et cetera. But again, like these aren't separate registers either. They're actually intertwined, and there is libidinal investment. I think even if you look at somebody like Zizek, who says that, you know, it in today's like the capitalist discourse, the ideology is not one of prohibition of like the primal father, more of an imperative to enjoy. So enjoyment has this libidinal function, and it's both an imperative by the superego, your enjoyment of being successful, of being a CEO, of grinding and hustling, right? It's not a saying you shall not, it's like you must, this is gonna be it, like work on yourself, like do Wim Hof every day, wake up at 4, or like just the fact of like, being an influence, the fact that you see like in advertisements, for whatever the product is, you don't see the product till the end. What you see is like a spectacle of people always smiling, like they're always like at this random setting where it's just like so vague, but they're bringing the livelihood to it. They're always just like smiling at something, laughing and giggling, saying cheers to something. This like imperative of enjoying, be happy, be yourself, which is not yourself, but it's an ego ideal. But in that, there is this investment in saying like, then I'll kind of feel like whole again, which could probably tie into lack as well.
Do you think with the sort of enjoyment politics that dominate our lives today, that there is an increasing process of collapsing the superego and ego ideal, almost in just such a way that it's like once upon a time, denying your enjoyment would have been more in line with cultural expectations, and therefore your ego ideal would have been more defined by foregoing enjoyment, whereas like there is a super egoic imperative to enjoy and be seen enjoying in the manner that the ego ideal affords the individual.
Yes, and I think it's mainly because like of the fact that Freud was working on this repressive hypothesis, and he didn't really see things as in terms of enjoyment or desires as desire of the other. Rather, it's just like this unfulfilled wish. But yeah, there is this unfulfilled wish that the other was not granting me, but it's like now it's like you're granted it, but it's like a relaying of like you must enjoy, but you don't really know what you're supposed to enjoy. It's like you're not getting the full message of what is to be enjoyed. It's just like this blank enjoy, but what does that signify? So then there's this confusion. So you feel like you're in this rat race of just like constantly trying to desire for yourself because the super ego says so and it aligns with the ego ideal, but it's supposed to bring you this similar semblance of the enjoyment of the primary narcissism.
Right, because what I'm thinking is like, I don't know, let's say in Victorian times when what's interesting is many taboo enjoyments were accepted back then, were just part of everyday life. But on the other hand, it's like what we laugh at in the Victorian figure of the patriarch, for example, is that sort of strained image of self-denial that is part of, let's say, the Christian tradition in some sense. And we find that laughable now, but it's like that figure may have enjoyed more freely because he wasn't expected to enjoy.
Yeah.
And of course, there's an obvious hypocrisy in it, because you're supposed to be this figure of moral rectitude, but at the same time, you're indulging in very, like, let's say, non-Christian forms of enjoyment. And both in that sense, it's like the ego ideal and the superego were more complementary. Whereas if the ego ideal and the superego are in cahoots, in the sense that the ego ideal says this is how you should appear enjoying, and the superego says enjoy, then you're at a deadlock where you don't know how to libidinally invest, because you're always thrust back onto that more primary form of narcissism, which is the narcissism that comes with the ideal ego. It seems more within grasp.
And I think,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think also something to add too is the fact of the feeling of transgression kind of maybe brings that alignment with something that is very simulating to the ideal ego, because you're always transgressing an imperative. We know that capitalism it commodifies transgression, and it allows transgression to maintain, the capitalist order.
Which makes transgression non-transgressive.
Yeah.
Is the problem. Because that's such a good point you make there, because it's like, what do we see on TV all the time? Like, to me, the one of the archetypes of transgression in our society is like the biker, right? The guy with the motorcycle who the entire, the highway is his home, and he has no set destination. He lives by his own rules, and he doesn't always bathe, and he doesn't care, and he drinks and gets into fights and goes from town to town. And it's like, but what could be more of a sanctioned archetype by the hegemony than that? And in fact, like, you have like bikers for Trump, right? It's like,
bikers for Trump,
bikers for Trump. And it's like, who is a better figure of, like, just, I don't know, compliance with a certain kind of status quo than Trump, despite the vision of transgression? Like, there's so much that's strangely traditional about him, but it's like,
I got something to add to that too, because, like, especially like if we talk about transgression, we have nobody to mention, but the freaking philosopher of transgression, Bataille, who best friends with
right,
with Lacan, and they do an analytic sessions together. But it's transgression is supposed to be, and I brought this up because to him transgression is this limited experience, because you are unlimited. And the fact that you're always trying to chase these desires, or maybe you're not actually like falling. I mean, I don't know Bataille enough to say that. I don't want to misconstrue them using, like, the language I'm gonna use, but pretty much like you are not like whole. And I think it's like this, the super ego kind of takes you out, it alienates you in the same way that unlimited experiences do. And that they're with the limited experiences that come from rituals of transgression, it brings that feeling, that gestalt of this embodiment, whether these transgressions are good or bad, or they're definitely not for the norms of society. They're definitely they're antinomian. And I bring this up because it's like another example is like the Church of Satan or the Satanic Temple, in which these antinomian religions or these left-hand path things are supposed to be, you know, against the nomos, against the law, against, you know, God, and they want to be their own gods. They want to follow rationality, but then they make an institution, and then here they are, especially the Satanic Temple. They're all about like liberal rights and stuff like that, and they're literally so like science bros. Well, you know, what's the dude name from Channel 5? The Channel 5 dude. He was
Callahan, yeah.
yeah, he interviewed somebody from the Satanic Temple and was like, well, what do you think of like you know, the fact that when I die, like, you know, my atoms, you know, since I'm atoms and molecules and just energy of the earth, that, you know, I just kind of recycle myself when I become fertilized and I come with the plants and stardust and all this and that. And then like the freaking Satanic Temple bro was just like, well, I would have believed that because, you know, that's not scientific and there's no scientific data or evidence or inquiry to say that's empirically true. So, you know, it's not scientific. So it's like the level of transgression that literally aligns with like the status quo, and just like a post-structuralist or just like deconstructionist would just find that cringe.
No, that's a really good example there. Yeah, because it's like, if you're going to be truly transgressive, this is why, you know, like I think the Republican Party has become like the punk movement of today, horrifically so, in the most perverse ways, because they do promise a certain extreme of transgression, which may afford people some jouissance.
Yes, and they idolize certain narratives that never existed, but in the sense they feel like it's true, with like going back to like with MAGA, going back to how America used to be. The founding fathers wouldn't want this. Even the insurrection, like it's this level of transgression, but yet nothing bad really happened.
No, it's like it's the last gasp of some possible transgression, but of course like going back to the bikers for Trump thing, it's not a kind of enjoyment that ever really comes to term, I feel like, because it's ultimately compromised by the same problematic of enjoyment that afflicts everyone, you know, that's not unique to liberals. Although I will say that your typical liberal probably has the most difficult time enjoying it.
Yeah. But it's just like you can see the super ego of a liberal as like the Karen, or like that, like what was it, like like she's literally a gift now. The trigger is the like pixie cut girl with the glasses, just like that's literally the ego.
Well, we're gonna get a little bit more into the super ego, but there's like a small digression here about the ego ideal in love, which seems to kind of come out of nowhere. I think it's just because this one guy, Granoff, decides to ask a question about that. But
because he's asking the you know, this, how does this apply with, you know, the theory of love, transference love,
power of love.
Yeah.
It's so basically he just says it's like love is just a purely narcissistic ego investment.
Yeah.
Essentially. And I think it's Lorenzo Chiesa says that sort of love takes place though at the ideal ego level, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The
point,
love of object.
It's so painful to deal with heartbreak because it's like it strikes right at the core of the ideal ego. Like it's the most vaunted promise of being returned to that state of embodiment.
Yes, and it's,
you know,
it's lack, and this is the whole thing of with this love. It's the romantic, passionate, erotic love that has a narcissism too, because it's like you get this feeling of wholeness or completeness, but that's because it's not because you love this person, but because you love that the way that they see you in this totality. It's like, oh, you know, I'm caught in the lure of like the way they're lured by me.
let's
Yeah.
put a pin in that, because I want to pick that up later when we get to like the virtual subject. But let's say we take 10-minute break.
It's like, yeah, ego ideal is definitely Kanye, but it's like ideal ego is Kanye, but the ego ideal is like the one would be like, oh, please don't tell me who's in Paris because I'll get offended. I don't want to know who was in Paris.
And I just know there's a city called Paris, and sometimes there are people in it of all different races, creeds. That's just how it works.
Just know Jay-Z and Kanye were there.
Speaking of Jay-Z and Kanye, no, well, Leclerc is here. Leclerc is to Lacan's Jay-Z, as I got the syntax of all this mixed up. He would be like Sauce Money, who I don't think numbers.
Sauce Money.
Yeah, look up Sauce Money. Nobody. Sauce Money was someone that Jay-Z came up.
Oh.
But yeah. Anyway, this is Leclerc. I like when he puts these guys on the spot. They always seem a little bit nervous.
Yeah.
You know,
they're really uptight.
Plays it so cool. Lacan plays it like Lacan's like the last person to have a Freudian slip ever. Ironically, like this dude, at least whoever is recording this didn't capture any of the slips, but he always speaks his mind with incredible composure, whereas everyone else they seem like they kind of hem and haw a little bit more, you know. But I like Leclerc. I know that D&G didn't, though, right? They did a lot of shit. They're like, you're a capitalist stooge, Leclerc.
They did not like this man.
So Leclerc has been given the task to give a sort of book report on narcissism, which is a really interesting essay. And as he says here, like, it's impossible to summarize because it's like, Freud, you just never know what direction his arguments, or they're not even arguments so much, but like his investigations are going to take, and the way he unfolds them, you're like, if there's so many twists and turns. So that's why it's really hard to summarize it.
His writings are very much like an investigation. Like he's a detective. He's like looking at like clues and trying to formulate things.
I admire Freud for that, because he really does leave himself out of it for the most part, and you really do see that he's very tentative about everything he says, because he's just like never like, oh, this is what it is, which is funny because that's how he's like portrayed in popular media, is like him being like, oh, well, that's your father, that's your mother, you want to do this is your desire, but that wasn't what it was like at all, you know. He often ends his explorations at an impasse.
And it's not like he's saying this means your father or this means your mother, but it seems like your mother and father have to do with something of what this means, like, or this, they could guide us to the meaning.
Exactly.
Just like how Zizek kind of says, like, he does his whole stunt on Freud. He's like, what Freud is trying to get when it comes to sexuality is that, like, ultimately it's not like that we're always thinking about sex, that's what libido is. It's trying to aim at something sexual, but it's that when we are sexual, we are thinking about something.
Right. And like, yeah, per that, it's like, when we're like, why are we such a sex fixated society? Well, everything that we think of, that we associate with the act of sex and the sexualization of different images, and like what we, like the commodification of sex, it's like all of that exists as a distraction from sex is the thing. All of the fantasies that, like the popular fantasies that pervade our lives having to do with sex, they distract us from sex. That's not what Freud's talking about when he talks about sex, you know. But anyway, I think we're getting off track here. So Yeah, so Lacan recommends we read this guy Wilhelm Busch,
Yeah, like some weird poet or whatever.
and he points out something really interesting that Freud talks about in his essay, which is that this someone who is like a stockbroker whose entire life is all about finances and the stock exchange and taxes and all that, and then he gets a toothache and it's so painful that everything, and he says in the little hole lives the molar, like everything is somehow concentrated in this molar. So it's like, as he says here, the symbolic world of the prices can't really, can no longer compete with just the pure libidinal investment in this pain. This is, yeah, so that, like we said, this takes a lot of different twists and turns. He talks about hypochondria, sleep, dementia praecox,
Yeah,
right?
which is literally just
Schizophrenia.
schizophrenia. Yeah, it's
Schizophrenia.
the medical term for like the like super technical term, like the OG term. I'm not sure if it's still
Right.
used, but that's what it signifies.
And also paraphrenia. Is that
Paraphrenics? Yeah, it was paraphrenics. Is another one.
what is paraphrenia?
I think paraphrenia is something that Freud specifically uses, but dementia praecox is a form of or a medical category for like the different terms of like psychosis, paranoia, delirium, delusions, and schizophrenia. But I think paraphrenia is like the technical term for the specific illness of schizophrenia.
So here, because it's very difficult to understand what the connection between like sleep and hypochondria, and he talks about different parts of the body being eratogenically erogenously like invested, or libid. So he's talking about like varieties of libidinal investment, right?
Yeah, and you was trying to say is like what libido is like it, like we shouldn't think of like the sexual organ like as like the penis specifically the center of erogenous zone, that any part of the body could be erogenous in a sense of satisfaction. Like think of like, for instance, how people get this like in libidinal investment in like ASMR. So like the erogenous zones of the ears,
Right.
certain sounds that just like stimulate that like satisfaction, or people loving to get their head massaged. I mean, like you have no where else to look. Of course, people would probably look at it like this, but if you add like this Freudian context of erogenous zones, satisfaction, release, I mean, I wouldn't have to go to like looking at holistic medicine and massage and like acupuncture, but look at somebody like Wilhelm Reich, who investigated this with like certain parts of the body where like erogenous zones. Now I'm no Wilhelm Reich expert, so if anybody listening to this like has something to say, to correct me on, but not only are there erogenous zones, but you could find forms of repression and built up of the orgone or like the orgasmic energy, the sexual libido, blocked via repression, but it takes place in certain forms of the body. But if we Lacanianize this is also jouissance. It's still sexual energy, but it's enjoyment in this loop of repetition.
Right. So he talks later about like damming up.
Yeah.
How
like
the sexual energy can get dammed up at different points.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that is meant to be symptomatic of a kind of primary narcissism, right? That persists.
Yeah. And I think the damned up is like with this totality of the body. Like, of course, because this is where in our narcissism, Freud even says that narcissism could be seen as like the love of one's own body image. Like they take pleasure in their own body. Like it's the sexual object is their body, in terms of not only narcissism but also in his theory of sexuality, that their own body becomes a sexual object,
which would make them confined to the level of the imaginary in a sense.
in a sense. Yeah, it's like a symptom of yeah, because symptoms is it's like a really key, it's a nuanced term for an enjoyment symptom of like enjoying of one symptom, but like it's a narcissism because it's only in its own circle. It's not worried about the other.
What interests me here is I don't want to lose sight of previous chapters when we were talking about Verneinung, and I think it's Anstang,
Yeah,
and Beerhung and all these German words for the like, taking in, and then the expulsion, and how object formation comes about, but we're still struggling to understand object relations in that sense. What exactly is an object?
and yeah, and that's the thing, is like an object is not like in the way like old school like classical empiricist bros were just like saying like our knowledge of objects corresponds to real objects. Like there is a representation, but it's accurately identical to the object. Like some I think this was his name, John Searle, like the American analytic philosopher. He's like a realism kind of philosopher, but like there is really red. The color red is really an object out in the world, and all these things. What I'm seeing is actually objective. Whereas like no, what we're dealing with object is more of representation, and it's split from the reality. We should see it as more of like a Kantian phenomenon versus the noumena. But I think the noumena is more of like, and again, like we should think of like when Zizek says Kant is the perfect neurotic subject, the Lacanian neurotic subject, in the sense it's that the noumena only exists if we put limitations and placements on reality that justifies what we experience. But this noumena is like this lost object, this object that I can't attain, but it only exists because of the way I create these like neurotic imperatives on how to view reality, like a prohibition on pleasure, a prohibition on certain things,
which in a sense contours the very object. Yeah. And what's fascinating is it's like the barrier between phenomena and noumena is a contour, is the limits of our knowledge, supposedly. But that is you're right, it's like a very neurotic sort of stance in that sense.
Yeah, and it's like, it's not like our relation to objects, but a relation to object that is always distorted, and that's always being, in a sense, fetishized to a degree.
Right. So what, like Lacan's Hegelian twist then is to show how the noumena penetrates phenomenon.
Yeah,
but there isn't this clear distinction between the two in a sense. Maybe I'm stretching the metaphor a little beyond its capacity, but Hegel sees noumena as present in the object already, delimiting it. But sort of what we were talking about with Brian yesterday, it's like the structure of reality, what structures an object, can only be like measured, and not measured, no, that's not the word, but can only be apprehensible within the present given object. So it is in some sense transcendent, but once you remove it from the context of the object, in this case the ego, it's nothing. It's not there. And that's what Kant wants to do. And he wants to say, well, you can't access it anyway because we're limited. But no, it's there. It's transcendent, but it must be found within the confines of the contingent.
Yes.
But anyway, I think we're kind of, no, we're building a larger philosophical context here for this, and it's hard to figure out what to focus on here, but we're talking about, yes, the imaginary versus the real. So it's like, it seems like he's saying there is so much potential for just being a narcissist in the primary sense, because there's so much satisfaction to be derived from the body, from enjoyment of the body. How is it we aren't all paraphrenics, or all, why don't we just all just go with dementia praecox as like our structure? What affects that leap into object formation? And I think it's like, again, we're building up to the symbolic here in a very subtle way.
Oh yeah, most definitely. That's the thing. It's like we're still working through, again, you could see it's like, I would say, like a dialectic of the imaginary. It's like the imaginary, like, again, like it's like he wants to define or determine these clinical registers, but they have no choice but to relay their identity, their categories onto the other. Is this dependency, this intersection. I mean, of course, it's the Borromean and not, they all play upon each other. They're definitely different. They have different degrees, but in a sense, it's just like the dynamic structure of the subject.
Right. What fascinates me here is he says it's a matter of indifference whether one considers them, these
really,
objects that are sublimated or fetishized, however you want to say it, that are libidinally invested, as real or imaginary. And then there's this distinction made between anaclitic and narcissistic modalities,
which pretty much means is like anaclitic is like a leaning or a support. So like if we look at the primary narcissist, there is this anaclitic of the mother, because finally it's like, it's not like this ambiguous partial object, but then the mother starts to take this full body image, and that is the anaclitic leaning and support system of the primary narcissism, little by little, and this identification with the mother. But and then like that's where like the primary narcissism being like this one's ego formation and identification stuck in the imaginary, the mother's body, the mother's satisfaction, your satisfaction, but then the admission into the symbolic, the alienation, the castration of that, is where obviously the second narcissism comes in. But then it's like the lost object, that this back to not this like identification of the primary narcissism.
There's so many directions that you can pursue with this. It's very difficult, this chapter, because of the way they jump around from one thing or another. But I think I'm forming an idea. Let's take it back to the wolf child, for instance. That's a perfect, perfectly portrays everything you're talking about here, bringing someone to the level of like the anaclitic, because in this case it's Melanie Klein, right?
Rosine Lafort.
Oh, sorry, Rosine Lafort. Rosine Lafort, who must become this kind of symbolic agency for the wolf child in order for him to form proper object relations that are distinct from his objects, that are distinct from his body, and are able to, in some sense, allow for containment, right? container, contained.
The container contained, yes.
It's very complicated, but it's like, I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss to elaborate on that. I think you're better equipped to like continue this. We have these autoerotic sexual satisfactions, again, like preservation of the self, right? So these sexual satisfactions are self-preserving. And as you were saying, so it's not until we form an identification with the mother that we're also able to
as he
separate,
says,
though,
yeah,
in a sense,
well,
or
it pretty much, with the identification of the mother, it just brings this gestalt unity. It doesn't allow us to separate. It just allows it. What this identification is a mirroring of some sort of a narcissism, as so far as a unity of satisfaction. The point is that like the mother does become an object of satisfaction, but really insofar as that there's this, at least the way I'm interpreting it, of like an ego identification, but there's no, like, in a sense, symbolic order of the master signifier or anything like that. We have yet to get into the secondary narcissism aspect, but insofar as what he's saying right here, the meaning of support and Lenghong, that means that you can support yourself through I would say the identification in this relationship of the child and the mother, as so far as the child is developing a narcissism, a primary narcissism.
is there anything to the organism before a primary narcissism even comes about?
Yeah, well, it would just be like this raw libido, instinct, libido drive. But that was what we were talking about in the last section, or the section before, about the distinction between ego drive, libido drive. What
No, go ahead. Yeah, it's
with the narcissism and the Anleong, what the narcissism, we have two narcissistic functions, which of course comes from the symbolic, and then you have now this ego ideal, which can act as in a sense, it is a narcissism, but it's not something that was really the lure, this primordial lure. It's something that acts in a sense as a guiding point towards sublimation, like experiencing libido in a healthy way, in a way.
But before we get to that, I'm just trying to understand when he says anaclitic and narcissistic, these are on the same level and they're both like viable structures.
Yeah.
In a sense, right? And both, and even the anaclitic is narcissistic in its own way, right?
Yes.
But so the narcissistic would reduce the mother to sort of like part objects, or
for the most part, like it's like the partial object, like the breast, any part of the body satisfaction.
Whereas the anaclitic begins to shape the ego of the mother. I'm just confused of what.
Well, the anaclitic and Langhong is something like of it helps support the narcissistic function, because narcissism is one of the, and so far not just like a grandiose self, but also confuses their body for satisfaction in an actual narcissistic sense of like somebody in the analytic session lying on the couch, they have a grandiose idea of themselves, they have this huge enjoyment in themselves, but in a sense of like this small dose of narcissism that helps the ego,
right,
or just go forth. It's not purely narcissistic. There is this, I guess, this dynamic balance between narcissism and anaclitic.
But when he talks about the narcissistic type, he's talking about someone who will end up a narcissist.
I want to say so. Yes. Yeah.
Whereas the
Yeah.
analytic is at the level of a primary narcissism, but he's talking about also like he's trying to define primary and secondary narcissism as well as like who the narcissist in society.
Yeah. Not the narcissist in society or the narcissist on the couch, but the narcissism in the analytic is just like a part of the ego formation.
Right, but
from the baby's perspective, from the formation of the baby.
But Freud also talks about narcissistic personalities and like being a product of his time. He relates it to like narcissistic beautiful women, for example, who are like wrapped up in himself. So he's also in themselves, like he's also talking about adult narcissists, though, as well.
Yes.
This is interesting, and I read an essay a few months ago that also talks about this, what different forms of narcissism, what one loves, what one is oneself, what one was, and the person who was a part of oneself. And what's interesting about this is this breakdown also, according to one writer, I forget her name, but corresponds to the states of like privation, frustration, and castration, interestingly enough. I don't know if that's relevant to our discussion, but I just wanted to.
Which writer says this is this a Lacanian or is this?
No, she's a Lacan. I don't remember her name, but she wrote. There was an essay in like an anthology that was edited by Slavoj that was like clinical. Yeah, it was like different essays about Lacan and like various volumes, and like one was like cultural contributions, and this the clinical contribution. But I just remember her saying that. So it's just something to keep in mind. Maybe we can pick up on that later. But
I think this right here is where he's talking. It starts to get into like the concepts of like repression and sublimation with ego, libido.
Right. So he says something interesting here, quoting Freud, repression proceeds from the ego, from its ethical and cultural requirements. And then that what one man indulges in will be rejected by another man. Like what one man might consciously indulge in would be considered prohibited.
And that again, like could be like this, like the balance between like if the cultural requirements, ethical requirements, these are like this emphasis on something that the ego ideal does, not because it's the right thing to do in a sense, but more of like the way it functions is like because this is what the other would want of me, the big other, if you would say. But then it's like, what one man likes, another man doesn't. There's, in a sense, a way of enjoying this, we would call it categorical imperative, that kind of does make, I wonder if it makes one, in a sense, like feel a certain libidinal enjoyment of the ideal ego, or if like abiding by the super ego, abiding by this imperative is like I'm actualizing myself as a moral agent, and I imagine myself in like this totalized image, which seems like it is reflective of the ideal ego, because the ego or the ideal ego is like this gestalt of a false mastery, a fragmented image of the body, but we think it's a total image of ourselves.
I think Brian pointed this out yesterday. The most difficult thing to grasp when you're studying all of these stages and everything is that there's like an element of retroactivity here, in that the ideal ego as something to aim for, that's something that you want to recover in some sense, and that you're alienated from, the lost object can only be conceptualized from the perspective of the ego ideal.
Yes. And this is kind of very like this, like I think I keep forgetting this term too, but like it is helpful to use the fact that it is alienation, and then there's this reification of it as if it is something that is bringing about this ideal ego.
It's and I would like to write some kind of essay about this, because it's I hope I haven't mentioned this in any prior episodes, but there's a joke that Louis C.K. told once, which is about like being on a plane and finding out there's Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone on the plane, like they're like, oh, we have Wi-Fi on this plane, and everyone's like, oh, cool. Like they weren't expecting there to be Wi-Fi. I guess it's like before Wi-Fi was that common everywhere. But he's like, and then sometime after that, they're like, they announced that the Wi-Fi is actually down, and he's like, the guy next to him's like, this is bullshit, and it's like, well, you just found out that Wi-Fi was available,
Yeah.
and now it's not working, and you're sort of,
Yeah.
upset about it. You feel like some injustice has occurred. That's kind of like the kind of enjoyment that we're talking about, where it's like you just found out you had it, now it's gone, but it's like you're only able to conceptualize it as that which was taken from you.
Exactly.
You never actually had it. It's an injustice that it was
Yeah.
taken from you, but you would never know it was there if it wasn't taken from you, because it never really was there.
Yeah, this lost object, I guess, if I'm using that term correctly.
But
It's like, again, Jay and Silent Bob, they didn't know there was a movie about them and that they were characters, and like everybody's just like shitting on them, so now they have to like avenge their ego ideal. They have to avenge like the persona of who they are. Because even Ben Affleck's like, they're not talking about you, they're talking about fictional characters. Fictional characters, am I getting through to you? And then they realize like, oh yeah, but with like now they begin to embody these fictional characters of Jay and Silent Bob.
right. With the in order to get back to this sort of like
Yeah.
serene state of just being who they once were, but now it's filtered through this sort of redoubled image of that the other sees.
Yeah.
So, right. So he seeks to recover it in the form of the ego ideal, the ideal ego, this kind of enjoyment that he feels he has sacrificed. Okay, I think we covered most of this. That now this is where it gets a little confusing for me. Sublimation, right? Object libido. Just 1 second. I'm gonna just stop my video real quick, but maybe you can I'm gonna tee you up for this.
So Freud has postulated the existence of the ideal ego, which he then calls the ego ideal, or the form of the ideal ego. He says from there that is the only one step to the searching out of the relation of the formation of the ideal to the sublimation. Sublimation is a process involving object libido. In contrast, idealization deals with the object which has been ennobled, elevated, and it does so without any modification in nature. Idealization is no less possible in the domain of ego libido than in that of the object libido. I think, again, this is like what I was trying to get ahead of like the fact that there is this relationship of ego ideal, not only with the ideal ego and like the way they're dynamically bounced back, but they have this relationship because of this process of sublimation. It seems like object libido it needs to be enjoyed in a sublimated form because the ego ideal has this cultural constraint, this sort of prohibition, this requirement of how much you should enjoy or what you should do and what not to do. And the object libido, of course, is the object of satisfaction. But again, it could be idealized in the sense so far as, and we're talking about just representations, but it helps to kind of bounce back with like cultural things, cultural like pop culture things, or even like William Zizek and his Marxism of like the commodity fetishism, in which like, yeah, these are part of like the culture, like the modes of production, but they have a cultural sentiment now because of its fetishization, not because they're goods for nature or for survival or the whole Marxist anthropology of need, but rather because of this idealization of bringing this wholeness, this fulfillment. But it's not like this radical like thing of like this blind insatiable id. It's more of like the fulfillment of feeling a gestalt wholeness.
So is he saying that this sublimation is a kind of cognitive mapping of objects that tells us what's desirable based on what will idealize our ego further, in a sense?
Yes, because sublimation is supposed to be this process of in a sense like being able to elevate your libidinal desires in a healthy manner, and something that is exercised for cultural acceptance, for the symbolic order, something that can be in a sense signified for, you know, the overall social network.
It makes me think of like when a child, like I remember, I have a distinct memory of like a few months ago being with a group of people, and the dean of my college was there with her husband and her children, who were like, I don't know, maybe like 7 or 8, and the boy found like a leaf or something and brought it to his father. I thought that was just like the first thing he did with this object that he thought was unusual or strange or whatever, is to bring it to his father and say like, look, when you say like, look at this, there's an ego investment there where you're saying, does this make me good? Does this make me acceptable? You know, you don't, it's not enough to just appreciate the beautiful object for what it is. You want the other to see you with it and associate you with it, in a sense. And this goes back to like what we're talking about some chapters before with just object formation in general, and how the ego is formed, and how what's external is bad and what's taken in, what's introjected is good. And this is a process that, socially speaking, continues throughout our lives, especially like what's so stressful about meeting a new group of people, or just I don't know, starting a class or something like that, is like the pressure of having to, what does it mean to blend in or connect with people? Or it's like, well, what is going to be viewed as acceptable? Which objects, which signifiers do we rally around? Which master signifier do we rally around, and how do we quilt that, in a sense? And
in a sense, the way this play out of like this like sublimation, or even a failed sublimation with the ego and ideal, I'm trying to think of the joke that Zizek says, but it's like this, like, I think it was like a Slovenian joke of like something about like, may the dog fuck your mother or something like that, and how like the father says that to his son, but then the son retorts, but doesn't that make you then the dirty dog that fucked my mom? And then like the father is shocked and like as if like finally the son like is something distinct, but then the son gives him this gaze like, did I do well, father? And then it just totally ruins it for him. It's like, no, because then it's like, no, you're not really like in the you haven't like really it's not a failed sublimation or like something where it's like, oh, you kind of went back to this totalized pleasure of the ideal ego. It's like you actually furthered the ego ideal because you wanted to do something, feeling totality, this feeling of totality only for the other, as long as it's pleasurable for the other, not only just for you.
In this case, it's like a misfire, though, because
Yeah.
the father's scandalized.
Yeah.
Those are moments where, right, that's interesting, because there's another example where he got it. I'm not going to be able to do justice to the example. It's in For They Know Not What They Do, but he's talking about a short story that was like an American short story that was written in the 1920s, and how it's like a cocktail party and this group of people is playing a game, and they read this letter that was written to one of the men in the two couples, and there's something that happens, I'm going to butcher this, but where the person reading the letter doesn't realize that it's somehow like she's the person in question here, like she's actually the subject of the letter or something. And then it's like, at any rate, there's this disjuncture between who she thought she was and who she is. And this is what happens when you have those moments of like misunderstanding that can be really embarrassing or cringe, or that like you experience very suddenly the sort of like a wedge is driven between you and how you experience yourself, and the sort of like the otherness that is central to your being like comes to the fore. Whereas most times in life we're like always trying to perfect the entire operation of being accepted by like cathecting, let's say, to the right objects.
Yeah.
But there are misfires, and then
Yes.
suddenly, boom, I'm not who I thought I was. I'm suddenly disconnected from this image. But so now he talks about the super ego, vigilance and security as its function. And I think, I don't know if Claire really gets the specific like how the super ego is separate from the ego ideal, but he does say like in psychosis it becomes purely exteriorized, right? The super ego is something that follows you and that you imagine as like a voice independent of your internal existence.
Yes, it's literally everything is seen out like it's foreclosed, but it's not a part of your unconscious. It's literally like something seen as out there in a hallucination, and where the imaginary take a hold of it in this aggressive manner. It seems like, or aggressivity, not aggressive.
But the superego here isn't the topic of discussion exactly. I mean,
and we shouldn't confuse this super ego for the ego ideal, because in a sense the ego ideal still shares this imaginary relationship, but there is some level of symbolic agency towards the ego ideal. That there's still like some structuration of language within the ego ideal, but again, if we're talking about the ego, an ideal that's idealized, it's only could do so with the help of language, but there's still this process of mirroring.
It's like the missing
the
link.
master. Yeah, you're not the master, but you wish to be one day in the way you see yourself.
Right. You wish to be one day. That brings in the anticipation that the signifier suggests, I would think. This sense of like, why is the subject always like anticipatory, or why does it arrive too early or too late? Because now we get into the signifier and desire, and the signifier always in some sense holds the it tantalizes you towards what is to come, right? And that what is to come is the enjoyment that you felt you once possessed fully, but it's always deferred. It's
Mhm.
always set at a distance, and that is what gets everything in motion. And it's like right now we're trying to find what the missing link between the imaginary and the symbolic is exactly, right? And it's a strange inverted optical schema. But let's see, maybe we should just jump ahead, not get hung up on the superego, because I feel like his mention of the superego sort of diverts attention away from
Yeah.
the main track here, and like we're not there yet.
Mm-mm.
Uh
And I feel like, you know, he only brings it up just because we're talking about Freud, but and so much like I think he only talks about the superego insofar as like it's helpful to elaborate on his theory, but he really doesn't want to get into these tripartite of id, ego, superego because of his use of imaginary, symbolic, real.
Good point, right? Which he says like, oh, people have taken issue with this, but
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. Like he's really trying to lay the foundations for the Bromian knot here, and why it's important, and why like he wants to take the entire constellation of Freudian ideas but situate it within
Mm-hmm.
these three registers.
The idea never lived by itself, always with Plato and other ideas. Yes, yes. The idea is always it's always disembodied, the logos, right? But for so far, like there's also some reason how if the form, the idea is the logos, it's also the true, the good, it's also beautiful for him. But beauty is an image.
Mm.
I also think that's kind of unique too. So it's like this play with the logos being like the symbolic, and beauty, the beauty of it is in the realm of the imaginary.
Right. And in a sense, I guess for Plato, if you think about the divided line, it's like,
Mhm.
why did he deprecate the work of poets and artists? Because of this removal, this, this simulacrum
Mhm.
that they generate, which has the appearance of a lure, like the kind of lure that the gestaltic lure that Lacan is talking about, which supposedly leads the individual astray, right?
Yeah.
Away from the beauty of the forms, which are invisible, as something, as soon as those forms are degraded by the like phenomenal
Yeah.
replication, then they lose the true beauty, which is in the non-sensory,
Mhm.
right? So that's really interesting. um and that goes back to, right, like captivation, or he's going to say captation, which is his neologism for
Yes.
capture and captivation together.
Mhm. Both, yeah, they're being the image is both captative and captivated.
So he's talking about object libido, narcissistic libido, again back to motor functions.
Yes, which we talked about, which like it's pretty much
Covered that.
there is like a utility to the ego formation and its primary narcissism, which allows for this reconnaissance, allows for bodily utility and function. And I mentioned it earlier, and his at least like his credits to Merleau-Ponty for seeing that, or just phenomenology in general. But I think phenomenology for him fails is just the fact that it's just stuck in the imaginary.
He talks about this, cycle of sexual behavior that is set in motion by the lure of the image.
Lure.
I think we covered most of this. So should
we get into an elaboration of the optical schema with the, what is it now, the virtual subject, the virtual image.
Yeah.
Because now you see, like, okay, the eye, we're not just an eye, right? But see how it is like situated where it's now like behind, or it's in front of the concave mirror, and what you see is, like, in the plane mirror, the image of the virtual, and then he's added more like weird light angled things, like I'm guessing like these like more broken down lines that represent the virtual image, whereas the solid lines represent like the actual image, the real image.
And this virtual image is what is seen in the mirror in addition to the inverted bouquet.
Yes.
So now the eye makes more sense.
Not only, I was gonna say not only that, like, but also the virtual image of him, of the eyes, the subject's self, the subject's image as well.
What's fascinating though, and I think this is easy to miss, is that it's like, all right, why do we need this? Then it's like, oh, I just see myself. So I think I see myself from the point of view from where I'm seeing. But remember, you originally identify with the inverted bouquet. This is you.
Yes.
Right? So you originally identify with the virtual image generated by the real image in the plane mirror. You say, that's me. You're not aware. There's no point where you directly identify with the eye of the subject. But what happens here is, while you've already made, this is how I understand, you've already made the identification with the inverted bouquet by dint of the plane mirror. But what happens is, you need to establish, in order to be a creature in the world, you need to establish a place from which you are seeing your own embodiment.
That's the thing. And again, like the fact that the first aspect of the inverted bouquet is, we see the eye standing behind, or like the concave mirror was in front of the eye. So yes, there was this direct identification with this image, the mirror stage, the primary narcissism, at least, just that aspect, the function of the eye. And it was like established, the flowers or the vase, as far as we could call them real, could be the body or the drives, and they're contained. But this containment could be the fact that the mother is the container, and this drives of the baby and the body are the contained. And then now, as you were saying, the plane is something in which allows for cultural refinement, being thrown in the world, being alienated or castrated from the previous embodiment of the mother, or being contained. And then now it's like you see yourself as this abstract eye. You identify with the eye that is looking. And this constant battle with this virtual image that makes you think of possibly that time when you were once contained the loss. You didn't know you were contained until you were taken out of it.
Right. Wow. Okay. So yeah, this adds another layer of complexity to it, because it's like now you're identifying with two realities, right? In order to identify fully with this virtual image, which is unattainable ultimately.
And this is, yes, and this
I
is
just want to
where,
say, like, you need to define the coordinates from which you are seeing this image, and the only thing that relays back to you the sense of where those coordinates are is the illusion of a virtual subject as it's reflected in the plane mirror.
and it's pretty much a determination upon a negative, and the negative is a lost object. The dot, and then like this is what we're asking Brian, and what he even says in his video of like, could this real image be the Das Ding?
Yeah, and that's what he was confused about. And I think we're still grappling with the idea of the container. But I like the idea, Das Ding and the mother, because the mother is what you're contained. Like, there's a point where the child, the baby, feels that it can only understand itself as an extension of the mother. It is the mother. The mother's body is its own. It's contained within it. How is the baby gradually separated from the mother? What really, like, what intercedes to make that possible, make that separation possible? And this is why, don't neglect this seminar. This is why this optical schema, as difficult as it is definitely worth grappling with, and explains so much that has to do with the three registers to me. And you can directly relate it to Zizek and his entire idea of ideology critique, because this right here is where ideology takes hold.
Yes.
This plane mirror, which, Brian points out in another one of his videos, isn't, you can see it, it's not just a purely reflective mirror, in that it's like one of those mirrors that is also semi-transparent, in that the objects behind it are also reflected in it. So you, in seeing your own image, confuse it with all the other images.
This could be the
Here,
parallax.
like a shop image, or like a shop window, all the things behind the shop window. So think of this as a mirror, but also a shop window. Everything behind the shop window, you confuse that with your own image. You don't have a perfectly univocal apprehension of your own image. It's superimposed. It's contaminated with these other images.
We should really reflect on 50 Cent's song of "Baby Use a Window Shopper" in this sense.
That's what I was about to know.
Yeah. Two is, this is where where the parallax view comes in, right?
How so?
With this confusion of the mirror, not like confusion of the mirror, but the fact that the multiple images that intersect with the plane of the mirror, it's like converging the two realities of like ideology and this, like, in a sense, not nature as it is, but in the fact that you believe that, like, if your ego ideal is this natural state, or ideal ego, not ego, ideal ego as this like natural state, in the sense that if we talk about parallax view in Zizek, and how there's this convergence in which ideology kind of, in a sense, aligns with what we would say as the default reality. But we wouldn't know the default reality without the ideology, because the ideology literally reveals this feeling of, this is how we're supposed to be. Capitalist ideology aligns with this thing. It's like, yeah, no, this is how we're supposed to be. We're creatures of nature. Like, we're all about self-interest, and capitalism is the best system because it aligns with human nature, because we're supposed to be individualistic, and
right.
Competition is good, survival of the fittest.
Right, that is confounding the shop window images with,
and it's not just capitalism, it's the fact of like the way social Darwinism brought this up first, of extinction of species and stronger species, and how social Darwinism aligns with the modes of production or the superstructure in the base.
Right. Very good point. Because it's like there's I hate this term, but like chicken and egg kind of thing, where it's like
Chicken and egg, what came first, nature or nurture? It's like,
yeah, like, but it is, I feel like it does kind of apply to this, where it's like, yeah, no, we could only understand social Darwinism through the lens of capitalism, because the truth that it touches upon in that sort of, in the sense of like Lacanian half-truth way, is that we are incapable of understanding the world outside of the constraints of the logic of capital. So therefore, yes, in a warped sense, everything must conform. Nature itself must conform to the structure of capital. And that's where this is, but like this is all these crisscrossing lines is the illusion that leads to that. But another thing I want to point out is that it's easy, I think, to ignore the virtual subject, but this is where it gets really fascinating, really tricky, because it's easy to take the I for granted. Oh, that's me. Okay, got it. That's the point of view from what I'm seeing. Where this optical schema culminates is in the establishment of the I of science. And Lacan says the subject of psychoanalysis is the subject of science. And I think this is what he means, not in the sense that there is that science generates or necessitates a true subject that is different from like the subject of revelation, like Christian revelation, for example, but rather the real, like there are various illusions, degrees of illusion here. The purest illusion, the most illusory point, though, is this.
Yes, the I, this abstract I.
All of this, everything going on here, to my mind, and I could be very wrong about this, though, conspires to generate this point here, which is a point of impossibility. Yes. Once it's broken down here, it's impossible. But what you pointed out that I didn't realize, that is really fascinating, that really like explodes this in the best way for me, is this idea that this unity is what's lost.
Yeah.
As visualized here. This is the ideal ego. I knew that already, but the idea that it's lost as soon as the plane mirror is introduced, But the question I have here is that is the ego ideal, it's unconscious though, right? Because you can't map out your ego ideal. Like you can't you can say, I believe in this, and I vote for this person, and I'm the kind of person who does this, and I will never do this, and this is my code of ethics and stuff like that. That's all wrapped up in your ego ideal, but you can't really know what your ego ideal consists of.
No, and it's not that it's unconscious, it's the fact that it's never realized. It's always really just, I mean, you can idealize yourself, and that's what the ego ideal does, but it idealizes itself for another. I wouldn't say as much as it's unconscious, but it's never fully attained.
But does that mean we are able to define what we want to attain? That's my question.
Well, the thing is that because the ego ideal is still it still has its place in the imaginary, so it's like it's always being mirrored, but upon the other, not as other person, but the other can be like as an imperative, or like the object, or what you were saying, like I vote blue, it's predication, it seems like.
Its predication is,
it's like, I am someone who votes blue, I am someone who's like, I pay my taxes on time, all these things that make yourself good, or like I invested in crypto, like I'm starting to eat healthy, and I do keto diet, like I don't know, just all these things that like now boost up the ego ideal of consumer capitalism.
But these valuative estimations of ourselves are what we carry with us through life, and the filter through which we have even the most like common everyday experiences, in a sense.
Like, yeah, in a sense, yes, because like the ego ideal, it's not unconscious as it is more alienation.
But like, my question is like, if I go to a Starbucks and order a latte, am I experiencing that as like, here I am, like, now I'll use myself as an example, like a leftist aspiring cosmopolitan in a major city,
Yeah,
with like a variety of friends of all different races and backgrounds buying a latte right now, like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, in a sense, yeah, maybe that like that could have that if you're really like then I think what would help to add that is the like, like the fact that Starbucks is like, I could support like ethical trade or something like that, or like Starbucks is the only coffee shop around in my area that really promotes like I don't know, something like Pride Month, or like Black History Month on these months, where other coffee shops seem to do so. So that's why I shop at Starbucks, because they align with my values, my imperatives, that make me this person that I enjoy. But it's always something that's never really you. It's always for the other. It is for the super ego. And so far as super ego represents like the imperative, this disembodied imperative. It's like the neurotic, monstrous, tyrannical part of the symbolic. But that's what helps locate the imaginary function of ego ideal. But in this ego ideal, this hope of trying to attain what seems to be like this version of ideal ego. Because the way I see it is, I see like both ideal ego and ego ideal playing like a role together. Like these two different things are not like mutually exclusive. I think they try to play a part. But I think really the ideal ego really acts as this lost object insofar as you only realize it in the ego ideal, because the ego ideal is alienation. It's the castration. It's the cutoff. It's the secondary narcissism.
And this is something, though, I still struggle with in understanding how ideology fits in, though, is if at the purely phenomenological level, before I articulate these thoughts, either verbally or just in my own head, if they're still in some sense operative in everyday interactions and transactions. And I think that's what I'm trying to understand.
I would say that ideology definitely operates on this form of ego, with the ego ideal, in the sense it's like, if you take ideology as the way Zizek says it, it's like in the neoliberalism imperative, it's like, be who you are, be yourself. But who am I supposed to be then? Like, that's the thing, is like, I don't know who I am. Or yeah, people like, I know who I am, like, the cynical people that believe that they have this distance and like they're not duped. They're just so like embodying the things that they find immediate gratification as, where it's just like freaking, they're a truck lover, they're always dipping, they're not a liberal. It's mainly because of like, again,
Right.
it's like who they are, who they're not. and that's where they get the most like feeling of individual satisfaction, because they're not this, they're not that, or they know like, oh, like, I always knew like, like Biden's doing this, or I just know that the government's up to no good. These pedophiles in the ranks at Pizzagate or some shit like that.
Let's see. Just want to check like this. Okay, we're almost finished because
Yeah.
wrap this up in the next 10 minutes or so, because there's still a few. One thing I wanted to point out that, again, I like to try to find the most perplexing details available, but he says the inclination of the plane mirror is governed by the voice of the other.
Yes.
Which is really interesting. What do you make of that? Why the voice
like
of the other?
The voice of the other is always like a disembodied voice, a disembodied imperative. Like we could call it the super ego, whoever the other could be. Again, it was like, what was the other line? It's like the child is like molded by their parents or something like that, and their like desires, or he said something along the lines of that. And if it's not the parents or like the father mother function, it's like this. I feel like this voice of the other is something that is leading up to talk about like how in the structure of desire, in his graphs of desire, like not only is there the signifier vector that intersects with the subject traversing up and around, but also as it goes through, and I think it's in the third graph, if not the second graph, the aspect of the voice. And it's like usually the voice that you're usually thinking, and it's like you could think of it like is like, oh, like somehow you pick up these weird like dislikes and habits or whatever that you never really like, or like sayings that you never really thought of, or and it's something that you probably adopted from your parents, and like, for lack of a better term, like you'll sometimes think in their voice. Like maybe if you had like a parent that was very disgruntled and was always like, you were in the car with them and they had like road rage, and maybe like people that were cut them off just happened to be like, I don't know, maybe they're low-key racist, and they like the person that cut them off was Asian, and so then like somehow you're driving and then you get cut off by somebody Asian, and then like you're like, oh, like you say the same thing like your parent did like when you were a kid. That's not your voice, that's the voice of the other.
Or people will say, oh, yeah, that will say something and be ashamed of what they said and be like, I feel like I saw this on Family Guy. So it was like Brian says something racist.
Yeah, and that's
like, that's my father. Oh, sorry, that was my father talking.
Yeah, and that's how the voice of the other could be, and not just in racism, it could be just in anything, and like the fact that and the way you enjoy, it's just overall the way you enjoy. But the racism is a good thing, because I think this is something that gets built up in people like Derek Hook. Todd McGowan has a piece on the fantasy of and enjoyment of racism, and other Lacanians on that point.
But do you think, though, also, do you think the voice is the metaphor that best essentializes the other rather than the image? I think like there's nothing more, and Madeline Dellar wrote a whole book about this, The Voice and Nothing More, in that the voice is the most strangely uncanny and otherly presence, because it's gone before it's there. It vanishes as soon as it's heard. Like you can't pin it down like you can the image so much,
Yeah, and this is something that I could definitely give anecdotal experience on with like the Navy and like the institution of just like, one of the things is like that they instill with you is like in boot camp, it's something called the moment of truth. You're like literally dazed and confused because you're just so tired as fuck, because you haven't slept in like a day, and you're just going through all the process of checking in. Like you get like your PT gear, your physical like fitness gear. That's all you wear throughout the whole entire time. You go through, get your medical paperwork, like you're just tired signing a bunch of stuff. You get your head shaven and your ears cut. Like I got my ear cut, but then you go into this room with a bunch of other like, you know, recruits, and you have no idea what's going on. And then like these master chiefs come in, and it's like, this is the moment of truth. This is how we know if you're right for my Navy. Honor, courage, commitment, the integrity to do the right thing when no one's looking. And they'll just say a bunch of other stuff. And then they keep saying that. But that's the voice of the other, this honor, courage, commitment, the integrity to do the right thing when no one's looking. It's not them saying it, it's the voice of the other. And when the whole thing of moment of truth is like, they say these lies like, we looked at everybody's paperwork. We know who you are before you get here. We know whether or not you smoked weed. We know whether or not like you did drugs, or if you stole, if you murdered. So if you are guilty, I'm gonna. You have like, you know, approximately 3 seconds to stand up. One, and then people just start standing up because they feel guilty, and they confess to some stuff that like, and literally they had no access to any of this. They're literally bluffing, but because people are so scared, and the voice of the other comes out, that people stand up and they'll confess to some stuff. And some people will literally confess, be like, yeah, I got away with murder, and then they end up getting processed out and going to things, or like, yeah, I did drugs before I got here, and so they get piss tested and they end up getting kicked out. But it's like they didn't actually know that. They're just trying to bluff you, you know, into thinking that you're this guilty person. So it's like the disembodied voice of this constant honor, courage, commitment, the integrity to do the right thing when no one's looking.
You know, isn't it funny how that can have two effects? Like you could either, like it could either have the sought after effect of, yeah, like forcing a confession from someone, or you could see it as like just ludicrously comical, in that like that you can see in that moment, you can perceive the disconnect between the body of the person before you and the voice.
Yes.
And it's like you can always tell when someone is channeling, like we could call it maybe a super egoic sort of voice that is not theirs, and it either works on people or it comes off as hilarious. If you could see, you know, it kind of straddles that. This is the phallus almost, I feel like we're talking about. It straddles that line, that phallic line.
Definitely. And especially like when you think about it, especially when you like, I talk to like people that work with the Navy, and like we reflect on like boot camp stuff. They're always like cynically talking about, oh yeah, that shit was just dumb. Like, but then they'll be like, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of stood up on that for some shit, but I never got in trouble.
It's both at the same time, you know. It's we know it's not there. I mean, because that's the whole thing with masculinity, is that we know no one really has it. No one really has the phallus. Like that's no mystery. You don't have to read Lacan to kind of acknowledge that at a certain level. But, and this is something Todd McGowan points out in one of his video essays I thought was really brilliant. It's not so much like, it's not that we have to hide the phallus so that people will not know that it doesn't exist, but rather it's the veil. It's the fact that it's hidden that needs to be hidden. And that's what's really, really fascinating, because it's like, that's like the way guys are generally, like cis type dudes, like traditionally like raised kind of cis guys. It's just like, you don't allow your homies to like overstep in terms of like bragging or like being tough guys. It's like kind of like a like sit your ass down type thing. Like, you're not hard, like that. Like men, like they regulate each other in that way. But then strangely enough, collectively, the collective ego ideal, it's like, oh well, if we're challenged, then yeah, we are hard, right? Like, so there's a strange kind of,
because there's no of it. Yeah, because it's like, and you said the thing, it's like the signifier of bros, it's like, no, we're homies, but there's no set hierarchy. There's only a hierarchy stated when somebody tries to like flex. It's like, no, sit your ass down. You're not like this. But it's not like to say that the other person that's saying sit your ass down is better. They're actually I think of it as like a Nietzschean slave morality. It's like, no, you're not hard. Just sit down. But the other person's not trying to be like brag back. They're instantiating like a contextual hierarchy by saying that, oh, this person that asserted some type of dominance really isn't that, but they get some type of hierarchical or some jouissance and being, in the sense, the mastery by negating the other person's attempt of mastery.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why it's an impossible position.
Yeah. Yes. And unless there's actually some type of concrete form of dominance where it's like, in a sense, gangs, initiation, and then like people getting jumped, who's the OG, because they're like hustling this much, they have this many bodies on their belt, or they're the one that have the biggest connections, the biggest freaking steez and witty charm, could get away with this, they know how to talk. Like, unless that's in place, like when you just like, oh yeah, my bros, this like this ambiguous confusion of like, really there's no explicit hierarchy, but there's an implicit hierarchy that comes out as a negation. It's like when somebody does try to flex, the hierarchy happens by the person who shoots them down, not by the person that asserts.
That's interesting. Yeah. It's not the person supposedly in charge isn't the one who shoots you down. It's the one who is between you and the person that's in charge. Because if the person who's in charge has to consistently shut down the people supposedly beneath him, then he's not going to be in charge. But it's someone who's like, look, this guy's in charge, not you.
Yeah.
That's the person who shuts you down. That's an interesting point. Let's wrap this up, I guess. I highlighted this in red because I really like this. The essence of the image is to be invested by the libido. What we call libidinal investment is what makes the object become desirable. That is to say, how it becomes confused with this more or less structured image, which in diverse ways we carry with us. So this is the confusion we were talking about before with objects of desire. So again, it goes back to like the blurred lines between inside and outside, in that there's never this a pure bifurcation is never achieved at this point, because we're always confusing objects of desire with what we are, and some objects are going to be overly invested. And I guess this is the key to our unique psychic structurations there.
And even that confusion comes with the narcissists who don't really have the just direct divide between themselves and the world, because they really see themselves in the world. They desire themselves so long as they can see themselves in every object they engage with, every person. They're always trying to see themselves in it, or they want to be seen and validated. Like they not only want to see the world or see themselves in the world, they want the world to gaze back at them and see themselves in it. So like pretty much they want the world to embody like how they feel. Like they want the people to be like, oh yeah, you're so great, this, that, and the third, and get that like libidinal investment in the fact that they could have that engraven image in the eyes of the others and like fully validated.
Graven image.
Yeah.
What about the anaclitic subject though? What distinguishes them from?
I think in the sense that for the narcissist, it gets difficult because sometimes the narcissist doesn't really need people a lot of times, but the fact that sometimes that their narcissism and grandiose idealization of themselves can somehow become antisocial or dysfunctional, whereas the anaclitic can sometimes be dependent on people. and I think that's also the problem too, in the sense where like, at least not now with the way analysis has progressed, but in probably like during like the Freud Jung times, it's like it was hard to have like the grandiose narcissist to transfer, whereas maybe the analytic could transfer, because then it's
Right.
dependent, yeah, on the analyst gaze.
So that leads us to the last thing I want to talk about before we wrap up is like he brings it back to love here. And remember we were talking about transference love before, so we don't lose sight of that. This perturbation of the function of the ego ideal, which is what happens with love. That's why, historically, traditionally, in poetry, I'm thinking of like, well, it's not so much about, well, you like the symposium, whatever, or
Yeah.
like medieval Italian poetry, like love is a kind of seen as a kind of illness, it's a kind of sickness that afflicts a human, it
Yeah.
scrambles your whole circuitry.
It's like the other aspect of the Platonic ladders of love, like mania, the mania, the madness of love that makes you obsessive, even jealous.
But how does it interfere with the workings of the ego ideal, though? That's what's interesting to me here.
I think maybe in so far as that, like your ego ideal could be taken away from you by something, by like, in a sense that like your love of yourself, if we're dealing with like the narcissistic aspect, somehow reality, like, the circumstances of reality could take away that like grandiose image of yourself, and you have no enjoyment, and that's how you end up in the analytic session, or in the neurotic, obsessive, like jealousy, especially in a love relationship. It's not because of the fact that you feel jealous or mistrustful for the person, but you have to. Again, it's like this, like what does Zizek say, like the pathologically jealous husband doesn't believe that his wife is committing adultery because it's true, for the fact that he has to justify his pathological jealousy, his madness.
Well, he says that even if it were true, it wouldn't make it non-pathological.
Exactly, and that's
the pathology, and
yes.
that's what's fascinating about it.
Yes.
So transference, it's like we forgot about transference.
Yeah, and all this does play a role in the transference, because then, in a sense, like, not only do you idealize yourself in the session, you start to idealize yourself because you're starting to talk about yourself more in ways that you haven't. You're associating, but then you could even have this ego ideal of like, how should I be for my analyst? Like, what does my analyst think of me? What do I think of them? Do they like me? Do they think about me a lot when I'm outside of the session? I kind of had this funny feeling of transference with my Jungian analyst, but not like in like this way, like what we're talking about. But like, I got to my session yesterday a little bit earlier, and I usually see the door closed, and I wait there in the little waiting room, and he's got his library right there. And it's just full of like Jungian stuff, and it's pretty cool. But he actually came in the door rushing, and he had his bag. I was like, oh, I thought he was already in the office, just chilling, either with a client or like, always have this feeling. I'm like, what if he's like in there meditating? What if he's just like low key like this like wizard? Because he's like this old man with a beard, and I'm just like, I feel like he's just low key, just like got some like sorcerous knowledge that I don't have, or something like that. Like just the way he looks. Like he's like this, like what was it from Lord of the Rings? You shall not pass. He literally looks like that, but just his beard is not as long; it's more rounded, but it's still kind of. Is it Gandalf?
Gandalf, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, yeah. So, and then he also has like on his desk like some like amethyst and like this wizard. I'm like, this motherfucker's like on some like new age shit. But like he showed up rushing in like a normal person. He had his backpack. I'm like, what's this motherfucker have? Like, so like there's this like idealization.
And what could he think of me?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then suddenly he holds the key to your ego ideal in his hand.
Yes.
Means that
Yes.
always means, as Leclerc says, that the ego ideal is the form of your ideal ego. So it's like the subject supposed to know is also the subject supposed to contain the knowledge of you that's meant to restore you to this previous state. But what's interesting is that there is something the analyst can do for you, which is not answer this question, which you approach the analyst thinking they'll be able to answer this question. They have this knowledge. What is my desire? But they can orient you. And this is what we we're talking to Brian about yesterday. They can orient you to answer this question for yourself in a sense.
Mm-hmm. And we were talking about like the signifiers, like creating metaphors.
I think that about does it.
Yeah.
Whew.
That yeah, that's the quilting point.